Welcome everybody to the Washburn University YouTube channel. I'm Danielle Dempsey-Swopes and I'm live in White Concert Hall. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our lecture with Dr. Harriet Washington and discussion following with Dr. Murphy and Dr. Carroll all about environmental racism. To introduce our speakers for this afternoon is our Director of Diversity for our WSGA, Ms. Megan Durantes. Megan?
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Durantes, and I am currently the Diversity and Inclusion Director for WSGA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this WooMester lecture and discussion, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Office of the Vice President of Academic Affairs, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Campus Activity Board, the Departments of Biology, Chemistry, Communication Studies, English, History, Psychology, Philosophy, Political Science, and Sociology and Anthropology. Now, let's introduce our panel moderator, guest panelists, and finally, our invited speaker. Dr. Laura Murphy is our panel moderator and is an assistant professor of anthropology at Washburn University. She teaches courses where students examine how past cultures around the world altered their environment, adapted to climate change, and responded to catastrophic climate events. Dr. Murphy is an environmental archaeologist, and her research interests include reconstructing past environments from soils and how people have adapted to climate change over time in the Great Plains. Dr. Valerie Padilla Carroll is our guest panelist and is an associate professor of gender, women, and sexuality studies at Kansas State University. Her current research centers on gender and environmental history and simple life and back to the land popular culture. Her publications include Fables of Empowerment, Myrtle May Bersotti, and Back to the Land Housewifery in the Earliest 20th Century in the Journal of American Culture, and Writing Women into Back to the Land, Feminism, Appropriation, and Identity in the 1970s, feminist magazine Country Woman, in the book Women and Nature. She is currently writing a book, Who Gets to Go Back to the Land? Gender and Race in the U.S. Self-Sufficiency Popular Culture, which examines U.S. self-sufficiency, popular culture media, texts that sell self, the simple life, as a solution to the economic instability, environmental destruction, and the perceived disintegration of modern America. Lastly, Harriet Washington is our invited speaker, and she is an award-winning medical writer, editor, and author of numerous best-selling books. In her work, she focuses mainly upon bioethics, history of medicine, African-American health issues, and the intersection of medicine, ethics, and culture. In 2019, Ms. Washington published A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind, which explores how poor people of color disproportionately suffer from environmental disasters, from injuries caused by lead poisoning to the devastating effects of atmospheric pollution, infectious disease, and industrial waste. Americans of color are harmed by environmental hazards in staggeringly disproportionate numbers. The systemic onslaught of toxic exposure and institutional negligence causes irreparable physical harm to millions of people across the country, cutting lives tragically short and needlessly burdening our healthcare system. But these deadly environments create another insidious and often overlooked consequence, robbing communities of color and America as a whole of intellectual power. Ms. Washington has also worked as a laboratory technician, as a medical social worker, as the manager of a poison control center/suicide hotline, and has performed as an oboist and as a classical music announcer for WXXI FM, a PBS affiliate in Rochester, New York. As a medical ethicist, Harriet Washington has a unique and courageous voice and deconstructs the politics around medical issues. In addition to giving an abundance of historically accurate information on scientific racism, she paints a powerful and disturbing portrait of medicine, race, sex, and the abuse of power by telling individual human stories. Ms. Washington also makes the case for broader political consciousness of science and technology, challenging audiences to see the world differently and challenge established paradigms in the history of medicine.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'm very happy to be with you today. I'm going to share with you a bit of what I have learned about the role of environmental racism in hobbling our intellectual power, both as individuals and as people and as a nation. And if you bear with me patiently for a moment, there's some slides I want to share with you. Could the host please enable screen sharing so I can share my slides? So environmental racism. One of the first misconceptions I had to address as I wrote about it is the common belief that we're talking about a socioeconomic issue. We're not. We're talking about a racial issue. Environmental racism doesn't actually affect people who are poor. It affects people of color. It cuts across class lines, education lines, economic lines to target people based on the fact that they are part of a minority group, a racial minority group. So even middle class people, for example, in the Houston area, living in the suburbs, are subject to assaults like, no garbage collection, zoning, a lack of zoning, so they live literally right next door to chemical spewing industrial plants. These kind of things only happen in communities of color. And one of the points I'm going to return to that I need to mention very briefly here is that although a lot of people have focused on the physical sequelae, which are quite horrendous, of all this exposure to toxins, I focused on the cognitive problems because the psychological and behavioral problems are equally dramatic and equally harmful, if not even more harmful, and yet they don't get much attention. One of the consequences of that is that our understanding of intelligence needs to be modified with what we have learned through science about exposure to toxic substances. And a lot of this means that sources of lowered intelligence that we have habitually ascribed to things like genetics, poor education, poverty, bad environments, actually are the result of direct assaults by industrial chemicals, heavy metals, and various things that poison the brain and the mind quite efficiently. And why didn't we see this for a long time? There's several reasons for it. Partly the industry was quite adept at deflecting blame from its products, but also there's a fact that the time interval between the exposure to a toxin and the advent of behavioral problems or mental retardation can be a very long lag time. You may be exposed as a fetus to high levels of mercury or lead or another heavy metal, or through air pollution. You can be exposed to things that will cripple not only your lungs and your kidneys, but also your brain. But that early exposure may not become apparent until you're an adolescent or even later. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to these toxins. And the fact is the brain does not develop until much later than we used to think. The corpus callosum that unites the two hemispheres of the brain, in some people does not complete formation until they're 30 years old. So long lag time between exposure and the perception of mental disorders serves to hide it, veil it very efficiently. So environmental justice refers to the poisoning of these communities. And it's important to realize they have not been passive. They have been very active, but they haven't always gotten attention. And there's also been a unfortunate contest for attention between the aims of environmental racism, which address survival issues, like things that will cripple and kill you, and the aims of the so-called recreational environmental groups. That's not a good term either, but it's used very commonly, so I use it. People who are focused on laudable goals like keeping the air clean, preserving wildlife, these are all very important, and they're tied to health as well. But they have very different goals, and not until fairly recently have they come together to both unite in seeing that environmental racism is a very important challenge. I'm going to show you a lot of slides, most of which I don't have time to discuss, but I want you to at least see them because that way you can raise questions about them during the Q&A if you have questions. And the disparate exposure of African Americans is certainly the case. Here are a few stats detailing what I've mentioned about it being race rather than economics that causes exposure to environmental toxicants. Even middle-class African Americans are more likely to live exposed to toxic poisons and heavy metals and chemicals than are very, very poor whites. Whites who only earn $10,000 a year have less exposure than African Americans who earn $60,000 a year. We're talking about a racial issue here. But one of the really frustrating things for me as I wrote this book, and I sought to collect data, was I realized very early on that communities of color, including African Americans, Hispanic Americans, are certainly dramatically and heavily assaulted by these exposures. But so are Native Americans. And yet, Native Americans don't have the prominence, not in the journalistic coverage and not even in the medical coverage. And I asked researchers about this frequently, and an answer I got frequently frustrated me a bit. I would sometimes be told, you're right, Native Americans have higher exposure, but it's only 2% of the population. And I thought, yeah, through genocide, that's no reason not to address it vigorously. I'm not suggesting it's not being addressed, although I don't think it's being addressed vigorously, but I am saying that the visibility is not what it should be. So one of the questions that has arisen with African Americans, a very good question, is the question of whether they are receiving COVID-19 vaccine at lower rates because they fear the healthcare system and they avoid and reject the vaccine. Just as during the studies and clinical trials, there were daily headlines claiming that African Americans were afraid of medical research because of the Tuskegee study, and therefore were not participating in the research studies. Actually, that was false. And I'll be happy to discuss that in more detail in the Q&A. African Americans did participate at a rate just near the rate in the population. So they joined at the correct rate, not at all at a low rate, and yet this mythology was very prevalent. You read it every day in the newspapers, and I didn't hear many medical people challenging it. In fact, I don't remember any medical people challenging it. So that speaks to also to mythologies. One of the problems with the assault of environmental racism on the brain is that there are so many mythologies about what constitutes intelligence. What does IQ mean? Why do some groups have lower calculated IQ scores than others? The mythology around that has been so single-minded and has dominated the conversations, and people don't realize that a lot of it is false. It's simply false, and it tends to consistently characterize marginalized minority groups as being less intelligent. And is that true? I don't think so. But it's a complex issue. There's no simple answer. It's nuanced, because the reality is, it's true that marginalized minority groups have greater exposure to the very chemicals and exposures that erode brain power, that erode cognition, just as they erode physical health. But the argument, the mythology says that IQs are hereditary. So you inherit a low IQ from your mother and father, and you transmit it to your children. That has been the hereditarian Bible. There have not been very effective rejoinders to that. We know it's not true, but the problem is it's so prevalent that it dominates all our conversations. So we can talk about it in the Q&A, but basically in my book, I lay out the fact that IQ does not mean what a lot of us think it means. It does not reflect, it does not measure any innate intelligent potential. Our intellectual potential is not measured by IQ. IQ measures intellectual achievement. And it's frankly simple to see this is true if you look at the component of IQ tests. What are IQ tests measuring? They're measuring things like vocabulary. It's telling that for a very long time, many universities would take SAT tests in lieu of IQ tests. SAT tests, quite openly, are designed to measure intellectual achievement. How large a vocabulary do you have? How well can you manipulate numbers? These are learned skills. And people who have good educations that are repetitive, let them practice the skills frequently, develop really good skills, have higher SAT scores, and have higher IQs. But somehow we've come to view IQ, it's been sold to us as a measure of someone's intellectual potential, which it is not. It also measures indirectly something else. The reason why IQ is useful at all in terms of measuring the degree of loss of cognition is because it measures achievement. People of a certain age who are expected to have certain milestones, to have mastered skills like addition and multiplication, have a vocabulary of X number of words, when they don't achieve these milestones, something is wrong. And that something can be brain damage. It can be other things as well. It could be poor education, but it can also be brain damage. And that's why IQ can be a useful measure, although a flawed one, for assessing some degree of failure to achieve these milestones. I did want to talk very briefly about, well, we'll talk about this in the Q&A, but I wanted to point out that despite the paucity of discussion in the literature, the Native Americans have also been exposed to cultural pressures that have affected their perception in terms of IQ. It's frequently the rating of Native Americans in the quote unquote Bible that lists IQs of every country and ethnic group gives many Native Americans IQs around 87, very close to African Americans that were around 85. And this causes hereditarians to tout this IQ gap. Why are there 15 points, 13 points between the IQs of African Americans and Native Americans? It must be genetic. No, it's not. But it's a useful mythology. The mythology that Native Americans were less intelligent helped to fuel the assimilation move. The around latter part of the 19th century, the idea that Native Americans could only profit by proximity to whites and should be forced into that proximity. Eradication of their own culture, their own language was entailed, and they were forced on the percussion bed of Western culture, Western civilization. How well they adapted to that was seen as a measure of their intelligence. And yet, even today, assimilation is used as a proxy for intelligence. Not being able to acquire the kind of skills that are important for success in the Western world and the white culture means a failure of intelligence. But it's not, of course. It's not at all. Also, when there are documented deficiencies, what are they due to? Are they due to genetics? Well, no, because Native Americans are, especially, as I said, plagued to these environmental exposures. 1 of every 10 US power plants on Native American soil. Electricity plants that cross Native American communities that don't themselves have electricity. Water pollution is much worse and has been much longer duration, at least measured, much longer measured duration in Native American communities. So we have this crazy quilt of risk that includes things like cultural biases and environmental exposures that too often do not get attention. And this mythology of hereditarianism that says intelligence is inherited rather than being dependent in part upon environmental exposure and in part upon one's culture. All the measures of IQ and intelligence are really interesting to me because the global measures look at different countries, measure their IQ, compare them to the US, but those measurements mean nothing. You can't compare the IQs of people in different countries. IQ test was designed for Western cultures where being able to read, being able to manipulate numbers were very important. Other cultures, that may not be true. In other cultures, being able to read well can have absolutely no effect on your ability to survive and to care for your family. Their definition of intelligence is something different, but again, we're forcing them on this Procrustean Western bed of having to conform to our idea of intellectual achievement. And this accounts for a lot of the biases that go into assessment. And lead and water are the focus today, but I always find it interesting to focus on a really important index of IQ. Today, there's a lot of hand wringing about the 15-point gap between blacks and whites by people who believe that means that blacks are genetically fated to have a lower IQ and therefore a lower intelligence than whites. But in reality, IQ, as I said, measures achievement, and it's malleable. It can change. We're told that it's once you have an IQ, it's set for life. That's not true. It changes within lifetimes. It changes over generations. Already that 15-point gap is narrowing. And in the West, average IQs have been rising 3 points per decade for years now. Now, in 1924, something interesting happened. There were other low IQ portions of the country, areas like parts of Michigan. And they didn't know why, but the IQ tests of Army recruits were showing that people from those areas had 15-point lower IQ than the rest of the country. And no one knew what it was. So they didn't address that, but at the same time, they were addressing something else, goiter. Goiter is like an unseemly swelling in the neck caused by iodine deficiency. And they knew that giving iodide could cure it. So they decided they were going to infuse the nation's salt supply with iodide. Easy and cheap, $2 or $3 a ton. You can spray the iodide, potassium iodide on salt and have supplemented salt. They did that across the country and everyone began eating iodized salt. And iodide deficiency began disappearing. Goiter started disappearing. And 20 years later, when there was a new war and a new slew of Army recruit IQ tests, they found that the men from those low IQ areas now had IQs on par with the rest of the nation. What happened? We closed the IQ test. We closed the IQ gap in 20 years very cheaply by adding iodide to salt. We didn't know it then, but iodide deficiency is a primary cause of mental retardation. In fact, it remains the world's #1 cause of mental retardation. So now we know how to prevent that mental retardation. We also know, or should have learned from that environmental exposures can be critical in IQ. We know now that lead depresses IQ. In fact, lead affects a great deal of behavioral components. When lead was removed from interior paint, when lead was removed from gasoline, a generation later, murder rates went down. It's a potent changer of human behavior. So all these things are things that we could have been using to improve our health, but we failed to do that. We failed to control dissemination of known toxins. I do want to talk just a bit about something else. It's important to realize that lead exposure is critically important, and industrial chemical is critically important for very young people. Fetuses and children up to age 2 years old devote 87% of their metabolic energy to building a complex brain. But if those children are exposed to an environmental toxin, industrial chemicals, air pollution, heavy metals, then that will interfere with the brain development. And it can interfere in a myriad of ways. The wrong connections may be made, or the connection may be made in the wrong place. Neurons will fail to migrate to the proper area. Structures end up not being made. Developmental milestones are missed. And there can be profound brain damage or subtle brain damage that's equally damaging, but doesn't emerge and isn't detected for decades. So children are very vulnerable, but adults are vulnerable too. And so we should be keeping better data in terms of a lot of these behavioral and cognitive things in relation to chemical exposure, but we're not there yet. All that has implications for testing. Too many industrial chemicals are on the market because they have been tested. Well, a lot of them have not been tested at all. That's one problem. But those that have been tested in adults. If they were shown not to do undue harm to that 150-pound white man, the standard body, then they're judged safe. Well, it may be safe for that adult man, but it could be devastating for the brains of fetuses or young children. And we often miss these problems. What does all of this have to do with coronavirus? Does it have anything to do with coronavirus? Yes. One aspect of environmental racism that gets very little attention is pathogens, like coronavirus, but also pathogens like the big five neglected tropical diseases, very common in the developing world, the global south, also very common in this country. In the southern parts of the country, which also happen to be the poorest parts of the country, which also happen to hold ethnic enclaves of Black and Hispanic people who are suffering from what we think of as being third world pathogens that often devastate their brains. There are parts of this country, especially in Houston, where tapeworms are invading people's brains. It sounds like science fiction, I know, but a lot of the cases of epilepsy are being ascribed to these pathogens that go into the brain, insist, and then cause brain damage and behavioral problems, including and sicknesses like epilepsy. These things are happening without a lot of visibility, in part, I think, because they affect poor people in parts of the country who also are people of color. In terms of the COVID-19, the coronavirus has not only affected people of color disproportionately, sickening them more often and killing them more often, but also there have been some mythologies that are hampering our ability to care for people. One of them is this widespread belief that African Americans, for example, were rejecting the participation in clinical trials. They weren't. I got the data from Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech trials. In each trial, they got about 10% African American subjects. African Americans are 12.3% of the US population. So as you can see, they volunteered at something very close to the representation in the population. Despite this, headlines were saying that Black people were not signing up for the trial, that they were avoiding the trials, and they were avoiding the trials because of Tuskegee. Well, they weren't avoiding the trials, and had they been avoiding the trials, it was not Tuskegee. You don't have to invoke Tuskegee. Actually, there have been a lot of problems with vaccine design, which we tend not to acknowledge. Last year, 2 French doctors, you may remember this, in April, suggested taking the ethically troubled clinical trials to Africa, where they could experiment on prostitutes and marginalized people who didn't have access to healthcare and would grasp at the research straw. There was a lot of outrage about that, as there should have been, but I'd read the same thing in medical journals periodically, papers suggesting that the developing world is the proper site for these troubled trials. And then there have been a slew of frankly unethical, often illegal trials, outright murders perpetuated by a handful of Western doctors who've gone to Africa, carried out these nefarious schemes and gone unpunished for the most part. And then of course we have our own, unfortunately homegrown version of this, where the CIA used a sham polio vaccine program to try to take blood samples and find the relatives of Osama bin Laden. They're looking for Osama bin Laden. They pretended to conduct a polio vaccination campaign, but they only gave 1 shot of the required 2 or 3 doses. And when they found Osama bin Laden, they abandoned the program, disappeared. When the people in these countries, Pakistan was one of them, discovered that the polio vaccine campaign had been a sham, that they were not immunized, and that there had been the CIA on a nefarious political agenda, they were understandably very angry. And as a result, the polio vaccine campaigns had a great deal of difficulty and were being rejected left and right by companies and individuals. In fact, 7 vaccinators were killed when they appeared trying to do vaccinations by people who feared they were CIA operatives, had other nefarious schemes. So these kind of research abuses happen frequently, yet when people cite their fear of vaccine studies, their fears are not approached with much respect. The fears may be wrong, but they're not illogical fears based on this very recent history. all these things happened within the last decade that I'm discussing. So we need to be a little more respectful about people's vaccine fears. And also we need to stop, I don't want to say lie, we need to stop manufacturing or giving into these mythologies about African-American fears. It's important to note, since I often invoke Tuskegee, I will point out that during the Tuskegee syphilis study, one of the rationales given by the doctors for not giving the men treatment was African-Americans are afraid of medical research. They don't trust us. They wouldn't take the treatment even if we gave it to them. Same thing was said in the Ebola outbreak, 2014. Those who were opposed, almost everybody was opposed to giving Africans ZMapp when it was found effective, said, well, we can't give it to them. They don't trust Western medicine anyway. It would be a waste of the medication. So you see that this falsehood about African Americans' wholesale fears is often weaponized and used against them and used as an excuse for not treating them at all. I do have some fears around the current mythology is saying that African Americans are rejecting the vaccine. We don't know that. There are a lot of anecdotal evidence given. People are writing great reams about one person they talked to, two people they talked to, and then they cite the fact that lower numbers of African Americans have gotten the vaccine. The fact that they haven't received the vaccine doesn't mean that they haven't received it because they're fearful. I myself had a lot of difficulty getting vaccinated, and I'm pretty resourceful. I have connections. It wasn't easy for me. So the truth is that we have policies put in place that operate against people of color getting the vaccine. And I'll be happy to talk about that during the Q&A. The policy, for example, of giving it to the elderly first, giving them priority. Consider the fact that African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans are all very young populations. They are unlikely to reach the age at which they enter that top priority group. So by prioritizing the elderly, you're actually withholding access to African Americans. We need to have a more nuanced form of that policy that protects the elderly while not restricting access to people of color. And I think that's really something to entertain. May I ask how I'm doing on time? Okay, I'll wind up by saying that one of the things that's happened during the coronavirus, which is really regretful, is that, but predictable, medical emergencies and wartime tend to operate against informed consent. We assume that people in this country can't be enrolled in medical research unless we...
Time.
Thank you.
It is. We're ready to move to the question and answer.
I wanted by saying that one of the things that's happened during the coronavirus. Thank you. So we've had some cases where people have been enrolled in studies without their consent. We've had some cases where treatment has been withdrawn from people in a eugenic way, and again, without their consent. These are things that we have to be vigilant against because they tend to recur during medical crises like pandemics. I look forward to speaking with you and answering your questions, and thank you so much for listening to me.
All right, thank you so much, Harriet, for sharing some of your thoughts just in a few short moments. I know there's a lot to tackle and unpack with everything that you mentioned. And so I just wanted to start by saying that for me as an anthropologist, I really appreciated reading your book and getting your insights, especially how you framed the beginning with the work of some of the early anthropologists that actually negatively contributed to racism and to this idea that African Americans and Native Americans had lesser IQ due to things like their skull size that was being measured. So you've given me and my classes a lot to think about as we sort of think about anthropology and its history in that development of some of these racist ideas. And so to just get right into it, to start right off, let's continue this conversation about IQ, because you mentioned just how much it dominates the conversation. And when you said that, I was like, I know I have to start with this because in our faculty colloquium that I'm leading, where we're having these discussions and we read your book, that was one of the things that came out right up front is, given the flaws that you really do a very good job of pointing out the flaws in the development and implementation of IQ tests, can you speak more about how we should be evaluating IQ data in terms of correlations with all of the environmental toxin data that we and other organizations are generating? And then what are some of maybe the advantages or disadvantages you see to eliminating the use of standardized tests like IQ tests?
Excellent question. I'm not sure IQ data are particularly useful in this context. We use it because it's the best thing that we have, or so we think, but it's not designed to do that. And despite the fact, I mean, you're right about the biases of the early developers and originators of IQ and the related tools, but it wasn't all their error. I can remember very well that Binet and some others were very clear about saying they developed IQ to test deficiencies in people who already were struggling intellectually, right? And they expressed their fear that they did not want it used blanketly, given to people and then putting them into groups according to their intellectual potential, which is exactly what we are doing. So they did warn us against this, but we have ignored their warning. I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the goal here? Because and the real uses. When you look at the real uses of IQ, I see that the book by Lin and Tutanen, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, their book, this global ranking of countries by IQ, right? It's being used everywhere, and yet I cannot imagine a less scientifically, accurate book. I mean, it doesn't even pretend to be logical or vigorous. It's basically a compendium of mythologies, So it's kind of, and so why is it compiled? It's used very often, even by people who will criticize it, but they'll still use it. And I think very often its real use is not necessarily to tailor goods to the needs of people, but rather to satisfy this hunger for hierarchy. When the people who invented race, what I found interesting was most of them were not content to catalog people by race. They had to put them on a hierarchy. There had to be a top rung and a bottom rung. And guess who ends up on the top rung? Person compiling the taxonomy, right? So how much of this is an exercise in simply, elevating one's own group, I mean, I hear these anthropologists saying, well, the reason why Westerners are so healthy and so smart is that they left Africa early and they had to fight the harsh winters and do all these smart things, and they're congratulating themselves basically for having picked the right ancestors, the smart ones, the hardworking ones. The rest of us are apparently the progeny of lazy people who couldn't figure their way out of Africa. That's absurd, but it does. You're congratulating yourself, you're elevating your own group, and maybe that's the purpose, but I know the purpose is not to address human medical issues. If you want to address the human medical issues, you look at the issues. I mean, we know now from looking at data around salt, all the data we have around lead now. In fact, some scientists even quantify it. We know that we lose 23 million IQ points a year in every age cohort to lead poisoning. That's really, great quantification. We need to use that. So if we know all this, we need to look at what's causing the human problems, what's causing the lower intelligence, what's causing the sickness. And then we need to figure out how to protect humans from exposure. And that often devolves upon controlling companies. Companies promulgate these poisons because they make money doing them. The lead industry was able to sell lead repeatedly in uses that people knew were harmful. The ancient Romans knew that lining your pipes with lead was dangerous. We did it anyway because the lead industry said, we really need the money from this and we'll show you how to do it safely. You know, it's absurd. So we need to stop that mentality. We need to basically not take into consideration corporations' financial motivations and take instead into consideration human health. In Europe, most of the European Union anyway, you can't use a chemical that's dangerous until you've tested it on humans. In this country, the testing is really poor, and we tend to test it really carefully only after someone's been poisoned. You know, we need to reverse that. So I think it's a matter of like deconstructing the risk and going where the risk takes us. And it might not have anything to do with devolving tests that rank us in terms of intelligence at all. It might have to do with eliminating exposure to like the known things that trigger problems. So I think we really have to be really open to different paradigms when we think about how we're going to address the problem.
Yes, absolutely. Just given that comparison to Europe, are there other countries whose handling of environmental racism out there that we can learn from? And Valerie too, if you have any insight into that, you know, please do weigh in.
I don't know this, and actually I would like to know. I'm hearing varying things about parts of Canada. I can't figure out if their abrogation of certain protections is fairly recent or if it's been going on for a long time and I simply wasn't aware of it. Maybe somebody knows this.
Right. So you do note that, you know, diseases most associated with the third world or quote unquote developing countries are sort of increasing in America. Would you be able to say more about that?
That actually I think has much to do with our climate. You know, the xenophobes love to point the finger at people and say, you're bringing your disease into our country. No, it's actually the fact that we're unusual. Most, you know, most of the big 20 countries, wealthy Western nations are cold. And most pathogens that cause the problems that we're having require heat in their life cycles. They like it warm. But we have lots of areas that are warm for them to reproduce in. And that's why we don't actually need climate change to introduce the problem. Climate change will make it worse, of course, you know, but we already have the climate that lays out a welcome mat for them. So that's one reason why we're suffering from things and other countries on our level are not suffering from them. You know, you don't have these problems in France, you don't have these problems in the UK, but you certainly have these problems in Florida and in Texas and parts of California.
Well, I think part of one of the really good things you do is lay out certain case studies that are really moving and really helps facilitate learning and understanding about what's happening to other people in our country. And one of the moving studies that, you know, I'm going to admit I didn't hear about was about the Anniston, Alabama case that Johnny Cochran was involved with. And again, all of these are very moving. And I wanted to ask you if there was any other recent documentary or case study that you have viewed or been involved with recently that really shook you to your core.
I've become a little hard to shake at this point, but you know, frankly, the news coverage will move from one hotspot to the next. You know, oh my goodness, lead poisoning in Pittsburgh. Oh my goodness, now it's in Flint, now it's in Boston, now it's in Baltimore, now New York. But you know, these cities don't have a lead problem. America has a lead problem. America has a problem with underregulated industrial chemicals. America has a problem with rampant air pollution. What I find really dismaying is not the individual cases, but the universality of them in our country. The fact that our entire nation is being held hostage. In my opinion, we're being held hostage to corporate interests as governments are kowtowing to, and an ineffectual EPA. EPA should be protecting us, Frankly, a lot of people, I'm not as angry with corporations as I sometimes sound. Because after all, so we're in a capitalist country. They exist to make money, and that's what they're doing. It's not their job. It's not their responsibility to watch out for human health. But it is the government's job. It is the EPA's job, and it's not doing it. So that's what I find dispiriting, the fact that we've got a country where we have all the resources, all the knowledge, everything we need to address these problems, and we simply don't have the will to do it. We're simply not doing it. We have a government that's abdicated its responsibility, and I hope things will change now. Things seem to be changing. I'm hopeful, but that's what needs to be done, and that's what really frustrates me. The lack of will, the lack of forward movement in the right direction.
Yes, and then I was just going to ask Valerie how your work with popular culture and media and that sort of thing ties in, and how we can get the word out.
Great. Yes, thank you so much for your talk. It was just wonderful, and your book is so devastating and wonderful.
Okay. That means a lot.
But one of the things that I found most interesting from my perspective is the way that you focus on the stories, like the way we tell these stories in the media and amongst each other. And that's a powerful way to get information out. And as you say, it's not the corporation's job, though I might argue with that, that we could make it the corporation's jobs.
Good.
It is definitely the job of governments. But you also talk a lot about we need to keep working for that, right? There are things that maybe individuals can do both politically and for themselves. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is things like urban homesteading, community gardens, people developing these sort of micro communities where they can work for the community to make it better. And I was wondering, do you have any, how do you feel about those kinds of actions and dealing with things like having to do soil remediation in cities that are the soil's full of lead, right? Do you have a perspective or a thought on those kinds of actions?
The last 2 chapters of the book I devoted to those kind of actions, things people can do in their own homes and things people can do in their own communities. And yet I find it very frustrating to talk about this, because we know that individuals can do very, very little. You do what you can do. I mean, that's a given. But in the end, I think it's almost wrong to focus on the individual as if they can have any real power to change these things. When I first came to New York, I was really charmed by all the community gardens, And then at some point, don't ask me the logic behind it, but I think Bloomberg was governor, and for some reason he decided that he was going to have a lot of them closed. A lot of outrage, but they did it anyway. And I thought, this is insane. A bit of greenery, someplace people could go and sit in their lawn chairs and talk and tend to their garden. And you took that away? Why? What's the point? It made no sense to me. But then too, I felt like, although these are pleasant things, it's like throwing a can of soda on a burning building. You're also talking about people who are, have lives that are difficult. We're not talking about someone who has a good job, plenty of resources, comes home in the evening, has leisure time. We're often talking about people who have 2 jobs, spend their entire lives in a rush trying to stay ahead of their bills, which in New York are no joke, and asking them to then devote time afterwards to tend the garden or do other things. I mean, that's nice, but they may not have that time. And if they do, it might be devoted to their kids or something like that. So it's burdensome. And frankly, even if they did everything they possibly could do, what would the effect be? Very little. You're still living across the street from a bus depot with poor air conditioning. You're still riding a bus every day that is not converted and belching gas. You still are living in a home that still has interior lead paint. You know, I mean, you still are surrounded by risk. And what little can be done, I don't want to put the onus on the individual, I guess what I'm saying, because, you know, personal responsibility has become a mantra for public health, but it doesn't apply here. Personal responsibility is for things that you can control. I can control whether I smoke or not, or whether I drink or not, right? I can't control whether I breathe. I have to breathe, you know. So I get a little impatient with that. And maybe I shouldn't be that way, but I am. I'm much more focused on forcing the government, forcing companies to, you know, do what they need to do to protect people, what they're supposed to do. I could go off on my rant about lobbyists, et cetera, but I'll spare you that.
No, and I absolutely agree with you. And I love that it's not forcing it on the individual. I agree that narrative gets used as a weapon against people quite often. Could you, maybe I'm asking you to solve the world, but could you talk about how people could get involved to make corporations responsible, to make government, or is that something that's just too big for the individual to try?
The thing is, it is too big, but in terms of getting involved, groups getting together and getting involved, you have to do that sometimes to get the attention of the government, you know, hopefully, to get the attention of the people who can solve the problem. You have to, the people who make a lot of noise successfully bring their case to the, you know, to whoever has power, have a better chance. So sometimes you have to make time and effort for that. And, you know, there's power in numbers. So, but the reality is, look at AFTA, North Carolina. They've been doing this and they've been doing the right thing since 1982. And they haven't won, you know? So it's very frustrating, but yes, there are, I don't remember them all right now. I wish I did remember them all, but I don't. But in the last chapter of the book, I detailed the agencies who have gone out of their way and done a beautiful job of helping communities when they reach out to them. And one of them that I can't forget is Earth Justice. Lawyers who are focused on, among other things, helping people combat environmental you know, exposures in their own neighborhoods. They're really good, because one of the problems is the Byzantine nature of government, right? You may want to file a complaint. You may want to complain to the EPA. You finally get the right documents. You finally get them finished and filed. You don't hear back for maybe years. Then you discover you filled out the wrong document. Earth Justice can help people avoid that kind of trap. You know, they've got trained lawyers who will guide you in making sure you're applying to the right place and appealing to the right people. And so they're very, very good. They're wonderful. And there are other groups like that. So communities really need to avail themselves of those angels, you know, who will help them hopefully actually get some solutions, get their problems addressed. So they're out there.
Yes, thank you. We had several questions put forth by students in Dr. Kim Morris's Modern World History course, and they're taking a close look at themes and sustainability this semester as well. And really, they just want to fundamentally know, you know, how do we get people in our community to care about these issues, like here in Topeka, Kansas, and maybe the students can start by looking at Earth Justice or going to the EPA and looking at what's in our local water and that sort of thing, some of the things that you have suggested. But are there other ways that we can get people organized and to care about this in our community? Because it's clear that students care, but like you said, there's only so much the individual can do, especially when they don't have power and they have landlords that might have, you know, vermin infestations. I've actually known several students who've had to move out and find different places to live because of bad living conditions with toxins and chemicals and vermin. So yeah, what advice can you give to students to get out there and help organize for our local community?
One of the very positive developments I'm really happy about is that I hate using this term, but everyone uses it, so they know what I'm talking about. recreational, environmental groups. Places like World Life Fund, Sierra Club. Some of these groups are now partnering with people concerned about environmental racism. And they're taking on these issues with the same fervor they took on maintaining the wild and keeping water pure and clean, maintaining recreational areas that are wild. Now they're really focused on environmental racism, which is a very good thing because, they already have decades of expertise that they can lend. And also because the partnership helps to make the issues more high profile to get attention from the government. So students can contact places like the Sierra Club and ask, what can I do? And they can become like a broker, And they had their first African-American president, Aaron Mayer, in 2015. They give an award for Robert Bullard, the father of environmental racism. They're very keenly attuned to it now. And that's a really welcome trend. I think that's like the civil rights movement, It was African-Americans who took control of their own destiny by confronting the system, even though it cost lives and health, et cetera. But I don't think that it would have been successful when it was if whites had not joined in. Those white allies were very important, not only for being there, but also for being visible and forcing the hand of agencies who otherwise would have been comfortable ignoring African Americans. And I think that the same thing, I think, is happening with environmental racism. I think that the presence of white allies can only help. So that's one suggestion I have.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think that is also really important, and it kind of empowers us and gives us some hope that there are ways for white allyship. And, an example of that is just how so many people drove up to the Standing Rock Reservation and stood on the front lines with Native American water protectors. And now there's still hope that they can have safe and clean water with being able to shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline. So there still is some hope there. So I just wanted to sort of end on a hopeful note.
Legal line.
Right.
Yeah, all this talk of law and order seems to stop there, but.
True. Yeah. Do you have any other examples of hope that you can leave us with here as we wrap up here in the next few minutes? And any final parting words for us?
I also think that any students who are eager to become involved should reach out to Robert Bullard. And I've got his email somewhere. I will certainly, his organization name unfortunately escapes me. I should remember that, but I just don't. But his organization, very important. I mean, he has been there, he's the father of the movement, basically. Still very active, still very important. And they should reach out to him because he will know more than anybody else. His people know more than anybody else who is out there, who needs help and who could best use the services. So that's another avenue. And read the last chapter of my book where I've detailed a lot of things I did not commit to memory. So. But thank you. I really enjoyed talking with all of you.
All right, thank you so much. Valerie, did you have final thoughts?
I just thank you for your work, and especially this idea that for white allies as well to work with other white people to make this. It's not just about can we offer help to people of color, but how do I convince the people who have power to do something, which is also detailed in your book, but just wanted to reiterate. But thank you for
glad you did. That's a very important point. Thank you for making it. Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Can we send it back over to Danielle for any final closeouts, or is it up to me here? No. All right, well, I guess it's up to me. So again, thank you, Harriet, for joining us. Again, it's been a valuable conversation, and we're going to continue that conversation on our campus. Yeah, thank you. Can we send it back over to Danielle for any final closeouts, or is it up to me here?
Yes, that's back to me. Thank you all very, very much. This was a wonderful event. Thank you very much.
All right, well, I guess it's up to me. So again, thank you, Harriet, for joining us. Again, it's been valuable. All right. Thank you. And Dale, I think will let us know when the live feed ends. So thanks again for everybody for participating.